Okay, let's dive deep today into something incredibly fundamental: how we think, how we know, and what happens when we turn that process back on itself.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Forget what you think for a moment, and let's really try to unpack the act of thinking itself.
These questions are ancient. They go back millennia in philosophy, but they feel so incredibly relevant right now, especially with AI and everything.
And the source material for this deep dive, well, it gives us a really unique angle on this. It's not some dry textbook.
No, not at all.
It's actually a back and forth conversation with an AI. And it all started from this surprisingly technical question: could a thought loop, like in the brain, become perpetual?
Right. It began really focused on the sort of the nuts and bolts, the information processing side.
Yeah.
But it quickly ballooned outward.
Totally. Into this much bigger exploration of, cognition, what knowledge even is, and how we inquire into things.
The whole process of inquiry itself.
Exactly. So, our mission in this deep dive, tailored just for you, the listener, is to navigate this really interesting conversation. We'll trace the path from the physical basis of a thought.
Neurons firing and all.
Yeah, then explore what happens when your mind reflects on itself, that recursive thing. We'll journey into the study of knowledge epistemology.
Big word, but important concept.
Definitely. And see how our ideas about knowing have actually changed through history, and maybe ponder why some, messy systems, including maybe our own ways of thinking, often just stick around.
It's kind of a shortcut to understanding some pretty big ideas about your own mind, really.
A journey from the tiny scale of neurons.
All the way up to philosophy.
Okay, let's start right there at the beginning with the physical stuff. The conversation grounds thought in this core idea. Thought is an electrochemical process in the brain. What does that actually mean in simple terms?
Well, at its heart, it means thinking involves nerve cells, neurons talking to each other. They use electrical signals and chemical messengers. So those electrical signals, they're driven by charged particles, ions, moving across the neuron surface, its membrane.
Right.
And when that signal hits the end of a neuron, it often makes it release neurotransmitters, those are the chemical messengers, into the synapse.
The gap between neurons.
Exactly, that tiny gap. These chemicals then float across and stick to the next neuron, and that can trigger a new electrical signal there. So a thought isn't just one zap.
No, it's way more complex.
It's a complex, dynamic pattern of all this electrochemical activity spreading across huge networks of these neurons.
It sounds like this incredibly intricate dance of electricity and chemistry.
It really is.
And the initial spark for this whole conversation we're diving into was the question: could you make a perpetual version of this? A self-sustaining physical thought loop in the brain that just keeps going forever.
Yeah, and from a biological standpoint, the source makes it pretty clear that that's not really possible. Not in the way we might think of, like perpetual motion. I mean, yes, the brain does have circuits where neurons loop back and excite each other again. These are involved in things like short-term memory or, getting a song stuck in your head.
Oh, yeah, I hate that.
But even those aren't truly perpetual.
Because the brain needs constant upkeep, right? It's not just running on its own momentum. It's not a closed system.
Precisely. Neurons need a continuous supply of energy, metabolic energy, keeping those ions in the right place, making neurotransmitters, releasing them. It all takes fuel.
Makes sense.
So without that constant physiological support, any specific pattern of activity will just, naturally fade out, dissipate.
Plus, there's all the other noise in the brain, right?
Absolutely. You've got interference from other thoughts, fatigue setting in, the brain's own systems trying to keep everything stable, homeostasis. All these things naturally disrupt any single consistent pattern.
So even if a thought loop feels really persistent, maybe you're stuck wrestling with a problem or just replaying a memory over and over, it's always drawing on resources, and it's vulnerable. Sleep, getting distracted, even just getting tired. These things break the loop.
Exactly. It might be sustained for a while, but it's not perpetual.
Sustained, not perpetual. That's a key distinction.
Yeah. The brain is a living, dynamic system. It's messy. True biological perpetuity of one specific thought pattern just isn't how it works.
Okay, so physical perpetuity is off the table, but then the conversation pivots, doesn't it, to a different kind of potential infinity, a mental one.
Right. Thinking about thinking.
Ah, metacognition.
Exactly. Recursive thinking, metacognition, the mind's ability to turn its own analysis back onto its own processes.
The source uses this wonderfully simple example, I thought. Adding 1 to a number.
Yeah, that was a good one.
You think 5, then you think 6. Simple enough, but then you can step back and think about how you just did that. What mental steps did you take? And then you can analyze that process of analysis and then analyze the analysis of the analysis.
And so on. The source puts it kind of formally, like $2 text thought about T and 1, where $2 is the first thought, like 6.
And $2 is thinking about how you got to 6.
And 222 is thinking about how you thought about how you got to 6. And, theoretically, there's no logical end to that chain. You could always add another layer of reflection.
It's like holding up two mirrors facing each other. You get that image reflecting an image, reflecting an image. It seems like it goes on forever.
Theoretically infinite reflections, yeah.
But just like the physical thought loop hit biological limits, our human minds aren't actually theoretical infinity machines when it comes to doing this, are they?
No, definitely not when it comes to actually executing an infinite number of steps. The source really highlights the practical human limits here. Our working memory, for instance, is finite.
Right, the famous 7 plus or minus 2 items thing. You can only juggle so many layers of analysis at once.
Exactly. You can only consciously hold and manipulate so much complexity.
And trying to maintain that deep level of recursive reflection, I mean, just thinking about it sounds exhausting.
It absolutely is. Sustained deep metacognition takes a lot of cognitive effort. It's subject to attention lapses, fatigue. You eventually just hit cognitive overload.
Too much going on.
Yeah, each new layer adds complexity you have to manage, and your brain's capacity for that sustained attention and detailed processing just isn't infinite.
So, while the possibility of one more layer of reflection always exists, the process is potentially infinite, conceptually.
Yeah.
You, as a human, will never actually complete an infinite number of steps. Your dive into your own thought process, no matter how deep you go, will always stop somewhere, bounded by your brain's current limits.
That's right. And so you can always conceptually add 1 to any number, but you'll never actually reach infinity by counting. The process can keep going, potentially, but it doesn't finish the infinite sequence.
Okay, so this journey, starting with the physical limits of a single thought, then moving to the theoretical infinity but practical limits of analyzing our own thoughts, it seems to lead us naturally to a much bigger question.
Which is?
How do we know anything at all?
And that takes us squarely into the realm of epistemology.
Right, which is?
It's a core branch of philosophy that basically studies knowledge itself. It asks questions like, what actually counts as knowledge? Where does it come from? How do we justify our beliefs? What are the limits? Can we know anything for certain?
The source touches on that classic starting point in epistemology, the justified true belief model. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. The basic idea, traditionally anyway, is that for you to truly know something, let's say X, 3 things need to be true. First, you have to believe X.
Okay, beliefs is step 1.
Second, X actually has to be true. You can't know something that's false.
Makes sense.
And third, you need adequate justification for believing X. It's not enough to just guess correctly or believe something randomly that happens to be true. You need good reasons.
Justified. True. Belief. Got it.
And the conversation we're looking at uses your own question from that source interaction as a perfect, real-time example of doing epistemology.
Oh, right. When I asked, how do I know that my definition of epistemology is correct?
Exactly. You weren't just asking for the definition. You're asking about the basis for accepting it. What justifies that specific belief about the definition?
Huh. Yeah, I guess I was doing epistemology without realizing it.
You were. It's a perfect example of the mind turning back on its own understanding and asking, okay, but how do I know this is reliable? The source mentions ways you might justify a definition.
Like looking it up.
Yeah, appealing to authority, like a dictionary or an expert, or checking if there's consensus among philosophers, making sure the definition is internally consistent, or maybe cross-referencing several sources.
But then comes the tricky part, the skeptic's angle. How can you be absolutely certain? What if the dictionary's wrong, or the experts disagree, or all your sources have the same flaw?
And the source definitely acknowledges that inherent difficulty. Absolute certainty is like philosophical gold dust, super rare, maybe impossible to get for most things.
Right.
Sources can be flawed. Definitions often have fuzzy edges or points of disagreement. And our own understanding is always filtered through our own biases and limitations.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you can aim for correct enough based on solid justification, but proving absolute unshakable certainty. That's a really profound challenge.
This whole idea of certainty, or maybe the lack of it, seems really central when we look at how our whole approach to knowledge has kind of evolved over time.
Definitely. The conversation highlights this really significant shift, often framed as moving from a more, let's call it, non-modern way of thinking about knowledge to a more modern mode of epistemology.
Okay, so what characterized that non-modern approach? What were they looking for?
Often the driving force was a quest for certainty, absolute certainty. Thinkers were searching for fixed, eternal foundations for knowledge.
Like bedrock truths.
Exactly. Maybe finding them in divine revelation, or in self-evident rational principles that you just couldn't doubt, or maybe in Plato's unchanging forms. Philosophers like Plato, or later Descartes with his I think, therefore I am, were trying, in different ways, to find these undeniable starting points.
And build everything else on top of that.
Right. The implicit goal was often to kind of end the search for knowledge by reaching these foundational truths, a place where that recursive thinking we talked about would finally hit a solid, certain ground and stop.
So knowledge was seen as this climb towards a fixed truth, and inquiry was supposed to eventually finish. How is modern thought different then?
Fundamentally different, really. Modern epistemology tends to embrace fallibility.
The idea that we might be wrong.
Yes, it accepts that human knowledge is often provisional. It's open to revision based on new evidence or better arguments. Instead of searching for those unshakable foundations, the focus shifts more to the processes.
How we actually get knowledge.
Exactly. How knowledge is formed, how it's tested, how it's justified within actual human minds and communities.
And it seems like it also embraces that reflexivity, that thinking about thinking that we were discussing earlier.
Absolutely. Modern thought is much more comfortable with, even celebrates, that kind of reflexivity. It asks how we know what we know, recognizing our own cognitive biases, the limits of our senses, the social factors that shape knowledge.
It sounds much more dynamic, less static.
It is.
And this shift from seeking certainty to embracing fallibility and process, it wasn't like flipping a switch one day, was it?
Oh, no, not at all. The source really emphasizes it was a gradual shift, a change in patterns, in tendencies over centuries. You can point to early markers, sure.
Like who?
Well, maybe Francis Bacon pushing for empirical methods, observation in the early 1600s. Or Descartes, around the same time, with his method of systematic doubt, even though Descartes himself was still ultimately hunting for certainty.
Right, he wanted that bedrock.
He did. But the real shift arguably solidifies later, maybe the 18th century. You get figures like David Hume raising really radical doubts about things we take for granted,
Right.
like cause and effect, or assuming the future will resemble the past.
Undermining certainty.
Big time. And then Immanuel Kant, who argued that our own minds actively structure our experience of reality. That really embedded reflexivity thinking about the structure of thought itself deep into philosophy.
So it becomes less about finding the final absolute truth and more about developing reliable ways of getting the best understanding we can manage right now, always knowing it might need updating later.
Precisely. The emphasis shifts to reliable process of inquiry, things like intellectual honesty, checking evidence, peer review, understanding context, and also just pragmatism, what works. Certainty is seen as rare. The focus is more on what's well justified, useful for prediction and explanation, and always subject to refinement. Knowledge evolves.
And this brings us back beautifully to another really profound point that came up in the source conversation. If these ways of thinking, these epistemological patterns like modernity, shift gradually over time, doesn't the very act of engaging with these ideas, like you, the listener, are doing right now by hearing this, doesn't that mean that you are, in some small but real way, thinking slightly differently now than you were before we started this deep dive? Maybe a tiny bit more modern in your framing, or just changed?
That's a wonderful insight from the source, and I'd say, yeah, absolutely. It resonates with that old idea from Heraclitus. You can't step into the same river twice.
Because the river's changed and you've changed.
Exactly. The very act of taking in new information, reflecting on your own thinking processes, it changes your cognitive state. The you who's hearing this now is already different, subtly perhaps, from the you who started listening.
So you can never really think the exact same thought twice under the exact same internal conditions. You might use the same words, but the mind saying them, the context behind them, has shifted because of everything that happened in between.
That's the idea. Your context, your neural pathways, your accumulated understanding, it's all in constant flux, even if just slightly.
And this connects perfectly back to that fallibilist model of knowledge we were just talking about. The process described in this source, finding a solution, later realizing it has flaws or limitations, revising it, maybe finding that the revision also needs tweaking down the line. This isn't some kind of failure, is it?
No, not at all.
In this modern view, it's actually the fundamental mechanism of inquiry itself.
The source frames it exactly that way. That is the fallibilist model in action. Knowledge progresses through this cycle of conjecture, proposing ideas, and refutation testing them, finding flaws, refining them.
Okay.
It's an inherently open-ended cycle, potentially infinite in the sense that refinement might never absolutely end. But crucially, the source emphasizes it's a virtuous cycle, not a vicious one.
Meaning it leads somewhere good.
Yes, it leads to progress, errors get corrected, understanding deepens, we develop better models, new perspectives emerge. Even if it doesn't lead to some final, ultimate, capital T truth, it leads to better understanding.
Okay, but the conversation doesn't stop there. It pushes this idea further, posing a classic philosophical challenge, a kind of what if.
Right, the counterfactual.
What if you could actually find one single piece of knowledge, one belief or condition that you could prove is absolutely certain and completely unchangeable? Wouldn't that definitively prove fallibilism false?
Ooh, yeah. That would be philosophically earth-shattering. I mean, if you could demonstrate even one domain of absolutely infallible human knowledge, then fallibilism, the idea that all knowledge is potentially revisable, would be wrong.
It would need serious revision itself.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe fallibilism would only apply to certain types of knowledge, not universally.
Yeah.
It would trigger a huge rethink.
But here's where the conversation gets really meta, almost looping back to the beginning. The source points out the inherent difficulty in proving such an infallible truth.
How would you do it?
Exactly. How would you convince others? More importantly, how would you convince yourself beyond any possible future doubt? You'd almost certainly have to rely on the tools of, well, inquiry, analysis, presenting evidence, logical arguments, critique, justification.
The very tools that are central to the fallibilist approach itself.
Right. It's like to prove fallibilism false by finding an infallible truth, you'd probably end up using the open-ended, critical methods that fallibilism champions.
It's a fascinating recursive loop, isn't it? The
Yeah.
mind trying to use its own processes to establish the limits of those very processes.
It's the mind reflecting on its reflection on itself again.
Precisely. And the point the source seems to make is that this inherent reflexivity isn't some kind of logical flaw or problem to be solved away in modern inquiry. It's a fundamental characteristic.
It's just what happens.
It's what happens when a system complex enough to think about itself tries to analyze its own foundations and limits. It reinforces why modern epistemology tends to accept this ongoing reflexive process as just part of the landscape, not a bug, but a feature.
Okay, this whole discussion about systems and why they persist, even with these deep, maybe self-referential complexities or just plain imperfections, brings us to another really intriguing, maybe more down-to-earth point from the source conversation.
You mean the PhD in philosophy thing?
Yeah, that seemingly silly redundancy, getting a doctor of philosophy in philosophy. It sounds wrong.
It does sound redundant, yeah. But the source explains this isn't really a deep philosophical error or paradox. It's more a quirk of history.
How so?
It comes down to basically language changing over time, linguistic drift, combined with good old institutional inertia. Things just sticking around because they're established.
So the philosophy in Doctor of Philosophy didn't originally mean the specific academic subject of philosophy?
Exactly. The term philosophy a doctor originally meant something much broader. It signified a scholar who had achieved a high level of mastery in general knowledge, reasoning, and rational inquiry, the love of wisdom, basically.
Okay.
So when universities started standardizing the highest research degree across different fields in, say, the 19th century, they often used this existing prestigious title, PhD. You got a PhD in physics, a PhD in history, a PhD in biology.
They were all doctors of philosophy in that older, broader sense of mastering rigorous inquiry.
Right. And then, when the academic departments specifically dedicated to the subject of philosophy started granting that same standardized degree, well, you ended up with the awkward doubling, Doctor of Philosophy of Philosophy.
And the source uses this principle it calls too costly to correct to explain why we haven't just, fixed it.
That's the pragmatic reason, yeah. The conceptual redundancy is pretty obvious once you know the history. But imagine the practical cost of actually changing the official name of that degree worldwide.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
All the university regulations, the legal statutes, accreditation standards, millions of existing diplomas explaining it to employers. The sheer bureaucratic effort and confusion is seen as way more trouble than it's worth just to fix a linguistic oddity that everyone basically understands anyway.
It's a perfect, concrete example of how Systems, even systems of naming things that are logically imperfect or maybe even a bit irrational, can persist simply because the practical cost and disruption of changing them is judged to be too high.
It's a really powerful sociological or pragmatic principle. Not really a philosophical justification for the redundancy being right, but a practical explanation for why it endures.
And the source gives other great examples of this too costly to correct idea, right?
Yeah, some really good ones, like the notoriously illogical mess that is English spelling,
Don't get me started.
or the QWERTY keyboard layout. Apparently, it was originally designed partly to slow down typists on early mechanical typewriters so the keys wouldn't jam so often.
Seriously, we're stuck with a layout designed to be inefficient.
Largely, yeah. But now everyone learns it. All the keyboards are made that way. The cost of switching the entire world to something potentially better like Dvorak is immense.
Wow. What else?
The U.S. sticking with imperial units, feet, pounds, gallons, when most of the world uses the much more mathematically consistent metric system. Or even our Gregorian calendar, with its irregular month lengths and slightly fiddly leap year rules.
None of these were designed perfectly from scratch based on pure logic, but trying to overhaul them now would be a monumental task.
Exactly. It really illustrates this concept called path dependency. How choices made in the past, even if they weren't the absolute best, create infrastructure, habits, and expectations that make it really difficult and costly to change course later on.
Legal fictions fit here too, maybe? Like the idea in some legal systems that corporations are treated as persons for certain rights?
That's another good example mentioned.
Yeah.
Undoing that concept now, with all the laws and economic structures built around it, would be incredibly complex and disruptive, regardless of the philosophical debates about whether it makes sense.
So it really seems like human systems, whether we're talking about abstract thought processes like epistemology or concrete institutions and conventions, they're often less about achieving some kind of perfect, elegant, logical purity.
And more about navigating these messy, evolving processes, practical constraints, and historical accidents.
A key takeaway then seems to be that many systems we live with persist not because they're ideally rational or efficient, but because the real-world friction and cost of disrupting the status quo often outweigh the perceived benefit of fixing their conceptual flaws.
That sums it up well. Pragmatics often trumps purity.
And after this incredible journey ranging from the electrochemistry of a single neuron up through the history of knowledge, the loops of self-reflection, and the inertia of institutions, the source conversation lands on one final, really surprising, concrete little detail.
Yeah, the energy cost calculation.
The estimated energy cost of that entire, quite deep philosophical conversation the user had with the AI. The source put it at roughly 30 watt-hours.
Which, as the source pointed out, is roughly the energy needed to brew about one small cup of coffee.
It's kind of mind-boggling, isn't it? Such a vast expanse of intellectual territory covered thinking about thinking, questioning knowledge, recursion, history, all prompted and processed using roughly the same amount of electricity as making your morning coffee.
It's a very thought-provoking comparison, a little reminder of the physical footprint, however small, of even digital inquiry.
Okay, so let's just briefly trace the path we've taken in this deep dive, summarizing for everyone. We started by looking at the physical reality of thought, those electrochemical patterns in the brain. Persistent, maybe, but never truly perpetual due to biological limits.
Right, needing constant energy and support.
Then we moved into the mental realm, exploring recursive thinking, the mind reflecting on itself. We saw how that offers a potentially infinite theoretical path, like mirrors facing mirrors, but it's always limited in practice by our actual cognitive capacity, memory, and attention.
Finite minds, potentially infinite concepts.
That launched us into epistemology, the whole study of knowledge itself. And there we contrasted that older, non-modern quest for absolute certainty and fixed foundations
with the more modern embrace of fallibility, provisional knowledge, and the importance of the process of inquiry.
We saw how this dynamic view means the very act of inquiry, of asking questions and reflecting, actually changes the person doing the thinking. You can't step in the same mental river twice. Both the knowledge and the knower are constantly evolving.
An open-ended cycle of growth.
And finally, we touched upon why many systems around us, from language quirks like PhD in philosophy to keyboard layouts, persist despite maybe being illogical or imperfect, often because the sheer practical cost and inertia involved in changing them are just too high.
The too costly to correct principle in action.
The striking thread connecting all of this, pulled from the source, really seems to be the dynamic, provisional, and fundamentally open-ended nature of knowledge and the process of inquiry itself.
Yeah, it's less about reaching some final static endpoint and much more about engaging in a continuous process of questioning, testing, refining, and hopefully growing in understanding.
The core insight we've tried to unpack here is that thinking deeply about knowledge reveals it's not a fixed thing, but a process. And maybe most importantly, the very act of undertaking that inquiry transforms you, the inquirer.
Which leaves us and you, the listener, with a final question to maybe mull over.
Knowing now, or perhaps reflecting more deeply on the idea that your understanding is always provisional, always potentially subject to revision, and that the act of asking questions literally changes your cognitive state. How does internalizing this perspective maybe shift the way you approach learning new things?
Or how you make decisions when you know certainty is rare.
What does it really mean to say, I know that, when knowing itself is something we're constantly exploring and reevaluating? Something to think about, keep thinking, keep diving.